Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History Valley podcast. And today, Dr. Brad Young returns to History Valley to discuss more evidence for Lukan priority and the Marcan Cross factor. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about the trial of Jesus towards the end and the motivation, the possible historical motivation for his execution. So welcome back to the show, Brad.
Thank you, Jacob. It's so good to be with you this evening.
It's good to have you back here. And here it is, everybody. Jesus and his Jewish parables, rediscovering the roots of Jesus' teaching. That's the book that today's topic is based upon. The link to purchase his book is pinned in the live chat, the History Valley Amazon affiliate link. So if you use the History Valley Amazon affiliate link, you'll be supporting my channel, and I get a small commission. And the link is also contained in the description below this video. So, Brad, can you give us a quick little summary about what this book is about for those that may not have seen your previous episodes here?
Jesus and his Jewish parables is a method of studying the gospel parables by comparing them with rabbinic parables, Jewish teachings. And the book does deal a lot with the question of synoptic relationships. That is, when we look at the parables, many times they have three accounts, or more frequently two accounts, some unique in Matthew, some unique in Luke. But we're trying to see how these traditions interacted with one another. And we developed a special, very intensive linguistic analysis in Jerusalem, sometimes called the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Studies, really guided me a lot in my research. I was there at a formative time with Professor David Flusser, also Reverend Dr. Bob Lindsay, also Professor Shmuel Safrai, where we were looking at in a kind of an associative comparative method, looking at the parables, looking at all the life of Jesus. And tonight, we're going to be looking at the theme of the trial of Jesus. And one of the texts I think is very interesting is the soldiers who were holding Jesus in custody. And what did Jesus do? What did the soldiers do? Kind of an interesting question when we look at the Marcan Cross factor, something that we look at in the synoptic problem. But in this book, I cite about 125 rabbinic parables. And then we look at this comparative method, seeing that underneath the Gospels, underneath the Greek of the Gospels, there seems to be a very early Semitic source. We believe that it was actually originally written in Hebrew. Some scholars believe it was Aramaic. Hebrew and Aramaic are similar. But when we use a careful linguistic analysis, we can see the Hebrew roots. I like the way that the famous Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said, when I put my hand over my ear and I listen to Jesus in the Gospels, I can hear him speaking Hebrew. I feel like he's my elder brother. So I think there's something there that's so authentic, so vibrant, so original when we start looking at Jesus' teachings and seeing them with their deep roots in the Jewish soil of Second Temple period Judaism.
And can you tell us a bit about the stemma proposed by the Jerusalem School?
Yes, this is the stemma which is outlined in my book in the chapter on the synoptic problem, where we see a Hebrew evangelium. Now, this is connected to many traditions in the early church leaders. Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis, talked about how Matthew wrote the gospel in Hebrew. Everyone would translate it as he was able. And I think what we see in that is that the teologia, the sayings, the oracles, it's probably the events, all of Jesus' life teachings are in Hebrew that are there, and then it's translated. Now, we also see sources in the Synoptic Gospels that represent this Greek translation, and also how sometimes it might have been edited, to make it a little clearer to Greek-speaking readers, audience, developed for the audience. And so we see that there was kind of a reorganized source text where some of these episodes, story units, were not kept in the original order. We weren't sure why that happened. Maybe there was an effort to separate parables. I mean, we kind of see that in Matthew's gospel, where he has a chapter dedicated to parables or miracle stories. But we do see the teaching materials. We see the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, and we see the passion narrative, very important, the trial, the reasons for the trial. All of these are a part of it. And we feel like there was kind of a reconstruction at one point. So what we see are two types of sources in Luke. One that is very Hebraic, going back to the reorganized source, and then one that is a little more edited. And then we see Mark using Luke, and he is influencing Matthew. And I think when we look at the stem and we talk about the Marcan Cross factor, this is what we're really talking about. Now, if you would read the preaching of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 3, Matthew parallel, these texts don't have Mark, and Matthew and Luke are very close in their wording and verbal identity. They agree word for word with each other. And when we translate those texts back into Hebrew, the preaching of John the Baptist for repentance, it's very clear that this has a strong Hebraic source. And so we feel like that's a common source that both Luke and Matthew had that went back to the reorganized source. We could also see that, say, in the story of the spirit that troubles a person is forced out. Then there's 7 other spirits that come back. Well, in that text, we see a lot of verbal identity between Matthew and Luke. But then when you go on into the next text, you have Mark. And you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke about Jesus' true kindred, his true family. Well, what we find is that Luke is being independent. Mark is changing the wording, and Matthew is accepting the rewording of Mark. So Mark is a cross factor between Luke and Matthew. Tonight, as we talk about the men having Jesus in custody, I think this is a very interesting example. If you look in Luke chapter 22 and verse 63, and I'll just read this. It's just a couple of verses in our new Hebrew Heritage Bible translations. The men who were holding Yeshua, Jesus, as a prisoner made cruel sport and tortured him. They blindfolded him, taunted him. Now play the prophet. Who is the one who hit you? They were saying many other abusive words against him, even blaspheming God. Now, it's interesting that in this text, it talks about the soldiers holding Jesus blaspheming. Now, I think when we look at this in context, we have to remember that with the arrest of Jesus on that night that he was taken into custody, John's gospel gives us a little more detail. He even mentions Heliarchus, that is a soldier, Roman soldier, high officer who's in charge of 1,000 men. That's much higher than the centurion. And he was with the soldiers who are going to arrest Jesus. It may be that the temple guard were there, others were there. They needed Judas to show them where Jesus was camping, and they arrested Jesus. They took him into custody. And now while he's in custody, he's being tortured. Now, a lot of the translations, I think the Revised Standard Version say, instead of saying blaspheming or blaspheming God, they say reviling him. But the word there in Greek is actually blasphemai, and it does have the connotation of blasphemy. That is, in the Mishnah Sanhedrin, we see that as Giduf Hashem. You're saying the name of God. You're blaspheming by saying the holy name of God. Now, this is missing in Matthew and Mark. When we go down kind of at the end of this episode with Mark, he starts talking about the high priest accusing Jesus, the ones who are talking to Jesus, trying to find a charge to bring to the Roman authorities, saying that he was blaspheming God. And then at the end of that, we have a summary about the soldiers hitting him, saying, prophesy to me. And what I think we see here is Matthew is following Mark's version very carefully, so that it's Jesus that's blaspheming. But when we look at the text of Luke, where we're talking about a committee, I think these were a Sanhedrin, a group of the priestly class, the Sadducees gathering together, and they're actually asking Jesus about a political charge. But what we see is that here is an independent story of Luke, and I think it adds a sense of what the torture was like, that these soldiers knew this was a religious Jew, and when you blaspheme his God, or you say, prophesy to us. My professor, David Flusser, said that these would be soldiers who knew that Jesus probably is within that stream of Jewish faith and practice, closer to the Pharisees, the Essenes, who believed in prophecy. But the Sadducees and your Roman soldiers, they wouldn't believe in prophecy, and they're kind of saying, tell us who hit you. They blindfold him, he can't see him. And then they're blaspheming God to hurt him in his spiritual sense, his own identity as a religious Jew. So it's very graphic in the way that it's describing this torture of Jesus as we see the trial narrative unfold. Another good example, I think, of the Marcan Cross factor is when we look at the wineskins in Luke 5:39. You know, we have this episode where we're talking about the new wine, and the question is about fasting. The disciples say, well, John the Baptist's disciples fast and the Pharisees fast. That what they were doing, they were calling new innovative fasts over and beyond the biblical feast or the traditional fast within Jewish faith and practice. And of course, the calendar is essential, because if you can establish a new fast, you really begin to start influencing people in their religious belief, and they become involved in your community as you develop innovative fasts. And they ask Jesus, well, should we fast? And he talks about the old wine and the new wine. And it's interesting because he doesn't really support the new fast. He says, well, if the bridegroom is with them, you wouldn't be fasting, you'd be celebrating. When he's taken, then you will fast. And then he says, do you put new wine into old wineskins? Well, it'll burst the wineskins. But in Luke 5:39, very fascinating. The conclusion, the climax in Luke's version is the old wine is better. And this is deleted by Mark, and it's also deleted by Matthew. I would suggest when we really study this, I wrote about this in my book, Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, that Mark is probably sensing, well, if he says the old wine is better, he's really saying the old fasts are sufficient. We just need a spiritual renewal of the people for the set fasts that we have in Scripture, like Yom Kippur, where we are all fasting together as a community. And then we don't have that in Mark. And Matthew follows Mark. Mark is a cross factor between Matthew and Luke. But I think it's very fascinating how that Luke in this text is kind of portraying the vitality of the faith of the Jewish people of the time. And maybe at later time, Mark, Matthew are feeling, like they're not entirely comfortable with that. But in any case, whatever, maybe there's no theological motivation, but we see that Mark deletes it and Matthew follows him. So we can see how that this cross factor exists. When we get Matthew and Luke together, most of the time in the text, they have a high identity of verbal agreement. Now there's one type of source if you notice in our schema of the Synoptic Gospels, we have Luke having the reorganized text and the the Greek translation of the Hebrew Gospel. It might not be in order, but he has those sources. Well, if he goes to this reorganized text, he has a little more editing that's been done to the Hebrew source. And Matthew doesn't seem to know that source. When he is in that area of the tradition, he is copying from the more Hebraic source, what we call the reorganized text. So when Matthew is relying on that source, he's more Hebraic than Luke is. One example that's very clear, if you read it in the, let's say the King James Version, rather not the King James Version, but a modern translation, you'll see quite a bit of difference between Luke and Matthew on the Lord's Prayer. Luke doesn't have our Father who art in heaven. He has Father. Luke has Avinu Shabbat Shemayim, a more Hebraic phrase, wording. And, you see some slight variations. Also on the Beatitude text, Luke makes it a little bit more people who are sociologically poor. Blessed are you poor, whereas Matthew has Ashrei Anyei Ruach, blessed are the poor in spirit, a phrase that we find very similar in Isaiah. Also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the exact same phrase appears. So we're at a Hebrew phrase. And in the War Scroll and in the Thanksgiving Scroll, Anyei Ruach, the people who are poor in relation to spirit, it's kind of a difficult phrase in Greek, hard to understand, hard to interpret. But when we put it in Hebrew, it becomes very clear. So those that know their need for the spirit, they know their spiritual needs, they are spirit. And so we kind of see a little bit more of a Hebraic flavor linguistically. We feel like we're on Jewish ground as we're reading Matthew's version, which I would say is representing the reorganized source text more clearly than Luke, who on that text is showing you the first reconstruction. So on the double tradition, that is text where we have Luke and Matthew without Mark, many times we have texts where they have a strong verbal identity when they're both quoting from the reorganized text, like the preaching of John the Baptist. Other times we will see that Mark, that they have a little bit of difference, and it seems like Luke is less Hebraic. He's adding a few different words, maybe accommodating his source for his audience. And there's always a little bit of editing of each individual evangelist. I would say, when I talk about the Hebrew Evangelion, when we talk about the early text of the Gospels written by Matthew, I'm not really talking about our Matthew today. I think Matthew had the name Matthew because he was representing this Hebrew or Evangelion, and he knew so many of these sources. And so it was natural for the early church to say, according to Matthew. I like the article that has been written that sees some of these early titles to the Gospels might be very early argument that Martin Hengel made in his study of the Gospel text, saying that, these are the words, the sayings according to Matthew, but he's not saying, we see those represented from the Hebrew Evangelion. But we have kind of a process of how the Hebrew Evangelion has been preserved and passed down. And so when we find the linguistic connections and we find the Jewish roots, the background, for instance, when I think that blasphemy is blaspheming the holiest name of God and how that would really upset them. But, when we see Jesus talking about, maybe quoting something from Psalms 2, which was originally the king of Israel in biblical times. Well, the king of Israel is the son of God representing God, and that might be a messianic reference, but wouldn't exactly be blasphemy to make that connection in a messianic context according to the definition that we have in Jewish faith and practice of that time. So when we start looking at the Gospels, I can see very clearly the different sources behind the Gospels, and we could reconstruct them according to the Hebrew Evangelion, the Greek translation, this reorganized source, the first reconstruction. And I think I could pretty much reconstruct all of these sources. I'd have to add to that the first two chapters of Luke show some special material that Luke had, very Hebraic, and Matthew has some sources outside of this. It's kind of hard to know where they came from. Maybe they came from the Hebrew Evangelion, or maybe they came from other sources. Some have even suggested that there could have been a gospel for John the Baptist. I mean, he was very prominent, and these first two chapters of Luke that really emphasizes the temple and John the Baptist's parents and the birth narratives leading up to the culmination. Well, we see John's birth being very important. Jesus' birth supersedes it. And we see these stories of the boyhood of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, kind of gives us a bigger, larger picture. But they seem to be some of the earliest sources from the life of Jesus. And, it could be that this was another source, might even have had a gospel or something of the life of John the Baptist that circulated among John's disciples. And what we see is that Luke, when in the introduction to his gospel, tells Theophilus that he has researched this. He's talked to eyewitnesses. He's looked at the sources, many that have written about it. So Luke's gospel also gives us some insight into how the gospel itself was composed.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the Marcan Cross factor and how this is a problem for Marcan priorists?
Well, Marcan priorists have, evidence for their theory. It's the prominent theory among gospel researchers today. And they generally kind of elevate Mark above Luke and Matthew. I think one of the reasons that they do this is that it is shortest in length. That is, when you have a shorter text in length, it appears like the others were enlarging upon it. What we've seen when we begin to study Mark is that it seems like he had a reason to abbreviate some of the stories. I mean, he seems to know more of the parables and some of the teachings of Jesus, but sometimes he'll just use a word or a summary. And we know that the gospel is emphasizing action always, and one event to another. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, Jesus is a teacher more. We see him as a teacher. He's on the mountain. He's teaching. I think people felt like, well, this is similar to Moses on Mount Sinai. And yet he wasn't destroying the teaching of Moses on Mount Sinai. He was saying, I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to give you the proper understanding. In Hebrew, that word to fulfill, likayem, is I'm going to go to the deeper meaning. He says, you have heard that it was said. Yeah, we have a lot of similar teachings like that in some of the early midrashim. It says shomea, and I might understand just from hearing the literal meaning of the text that it means this, but it really means this. So Jesus said, well, it's not enough just not to commit adultery. You have to control your thoughts, not to have adultery in your mind. You have to not have murder in your heart. Hatred will lead to murder. And of course, we see this in connection with the holiness code and how it's interpreted in the early Jewish literature and the commentaries on the book of Deuteronomy and the early sages teaching on this, and a lot of the connections, forgiveness, love, reconciliation, greatly emphasized in these teachings. So Marcan priorists, I think, have created this illusion that, well, they had a saying source. It didn't have the death, burial, and resurrection, the trial. It just had these sayings. They created this theory for the source Q, in that everything that wasn't put into Mark was a source with Matthew and Luke. I think when we look at the Marcan Cross factor, I think also another element that is widely acknowledged in the study of the Synoptic Gospels, that's what we call the minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark. That is, if Matthew and Luke are copying Mark as their primary source, as the Marcan priorists want us to believe, they would agree in what they're copying. But what we find is that sometimes they change Mark's story, and they don't just change it, they change it with the exact same words. And these exact same words are what we call minor agreements. Nobody would edit with the exact same words. And this happens frequently. This famous scholar, Narnik, he wrote a great account showing in the synoptic text these minor agreements, something we always study. And so sometimes people want to say, well, maybe there was a proto-Mark that had a little different wording or other explanations. But then when we go to this other understanding where we see that Mark is kind of a mediator between Matthew and Luke, and we can see this early proto-evangelion, especially in Matthew, especially in Luke. And Mark is kind of making it a little more Hellenistic, changing the wording a little bit. He's a creative writer, and he's trying to communicate this. Our early traditions say that he was an interpreter for Peter's preaching in Rome. Of course, we don't have independent or accurate information directly from the New Testament, but as a preacher, writer, interpreter, he might have worked in this. And I think a lot of our traditions from early church teachings, fathers of the church, there are things that we should really study and consider. I consider myself an evidence-based critical thinker. I want to be evidence-based. I want to understand the evidence. And it's most important to clearly articulate the evidence with critical thinking before you develop your theories. I think most people start with their theories and then go back to the evidence. I will say, when I went to Jerusalem to study in 1978 with David Flusser, I thought, well, I know he's kind of believes Marcan Lukan priority. That doesn't seem right to me. I would, I'd kind of challenge him on that. But, and he's a scholar. You don't have to agree with everything he believes is right with him. And he works with a lot of Marcan priorist. David Flusser had a very good relationship with Joachim Jeremias, the great scholar of parables, a great scholar that wrote on the language of Luke and really made major contributions to exegetical studies, linguistic studies. And they disagreed on synoptic interrelationships, but they could collaborate, work together on a lot of things. But when I began to see the evidence, especially from the Marcan Cross factor, that the Marcan Cross factor shows the difference between Luke and Matthew, that Matthew really did copy his sources with a little more accuracy probably than Luke or Mark. And so when he had the Evangelion, he's copying it very precisely. He almost always says, Malchut Shamayim, He Basileoton Uranon, the kingdom of the heavens, literally, or the kingdom of heaven. Whereas Luke felt like maybe, David Flusser says, maybe he thought that the Greeks would associate the kingdom of heaven maybe with Zeus, and they wouldn't understand the Jewish concept, understanding of God ruling heaven and earth. And heaven is the idea of the supernatural. God is working supernaturally. That to try to differentiate between them, you want to say the kingdom of God. So everybody will know that God is the God, the one true God of the Bible, not Zeus, not the God of the heavens. Also, he wanted to say your heavenly Father. He didn't want to say your Father who art in heaven, but so he prefers to use something like. And so that this is a matter of editing, maybe for Greek style. Flusser felt like he was, editing the Greek of the text to make it more understandable for the Greek readers who are coming along, whereas Matthew just copies it directly. We also see when he's dealing with Mark, when he accepts Marcan's view, many times he copies it very closely. I think we see this in this passage I'm talking about tonight about blasphemy, is if he had Luke's source, and the way we see the interrelationships between the Gospels, we would assume since he knew Luke's source, he probably saw that where it was the soldiers holding Jesus in custody who were reviling him, blindfolding him, prophesied to us, even blaspheming God. I will note also that the New American Standard Bible in that text translates the word blasphemy literally. They were reviling him, even blaspheming. They don't say blaspheming God. God we add in our translation to make it a little bit clearer based on the Jewish roots what blasphemy was at that time. But also the New American Standard Bible, very good literal translation, says even blasphemy. Then when we go to the custody section in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, Mark has it with this story of the priest questioning him and say, you're blaspheming. And then they were blindfolding him, hitting him. And Matthew follows very closely to Mark's wording. So, if you're Marcan priorist, of course, you're kind of looking at Luke and saying, no, this is all wrong. And Mark is right. Mark is the most important of the three Gospels. He's the shortest. He's the most authoritative. I think one idea that we ought to always remember when we talk about the shortest, it's not just in length, but what about in individual stories? I think we would find often when we look at the individual story unit itself that Mark is a little longer. He's adding more detail, descriptive terms than either Matthew or Luke. And a lot of times those descriptive terms are copied over into Matthew's version. So in some ways, we would say Mark is the longest of the Gospels because he's longer in content on many sources. Now, there's some sources like, the temptation of Jesus where he's making it very short. But I think we have to see this in context. Certainly the passage about Jesus in custody is a little bit longer in the way that he's presenting it, saying that Jesus blasphemed instead of the soldiers who were holding him. But and of course, I think we could harmonize these and say, it's both and. They were accusing Jesus of blasphemy. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is when we go to John's gospel as well, which is later and more theological. But John's gospel, interesting enough, makes the charge for Jesus more political, just as Luke's gospel is making it political. They needed a political charge to have the Romans execute Jesus. And so they're trying to get a charge where he's claiming to be the Messiah. Or we see the phrase King of the Jews frequently in the narrative in John's gospel, but also the idea of the King Messiah. Melech HaMashiach, King Messiah, is this political charge. Whereas if it's something about how you talk about God in a Jewish context, well, the Romans believe there are a lot of gods. They wouldn't feel like that's a charge for them. But you want to turn Jesus over from your custody with evidence that he is subversive and a part of a messianic movement. And what we do see from study of Josephus and the historians of the time, of course, is that the Romans would put down any type of Jewish messianic movement. And they were very sensitive to someone who has a large following that they're concerned about. But at this point, we see how that Matthew, Mark have a close relationship. We believe then in the order of the gospel, Luke was first, Mark is kind of a copyist, and then Mark is a transitional figure to Matthew. That Matthew had two sources. He had the proto-evangelion, and he also had Mark. So sometimes he's using Mark more, sometimes he's using the proto-evangelion more. When he's using the proto-evangelion, or this reorganized source that was translated literally from Greek that he and Luke had in common, well, then we see a large identity in the way they were, the wording, word for word identity between Matthew and Luke. But Mark changes that for Matthew because Matthew had a lot of faith and credibility in Mark's text, and he incorporates a lot of Mark into his story of Jesus and the triple tradition.
And so what you're saying is that Matthew tends to follow Mark's order better than Luke allegedly did, and Matthew often preserves Mark's wording better than Luke allegedly did.
Yes, if you look at the statistics, Mark's gospel is largely reproduced in Matthew. And when we look at Luke, if you want to do the same thing, much less of Mark is reproduced in Matthew. The Marcan priors are trying to say, well, Luke was copying Mark, but we see a lot of changes between Mark and Luke, and we see some interaction there. And this is synoptic, Jerusalem School of Synoptic Studies. We see that Mark is finding these things in Luke, and so there's some connection there, but it's not the way that the Marcan priors say it. No, Luke is first, Mark is copying, and he's influencing Matthew, and we see these sources underneath the Gospels. And I think that's one of the things that is so exciting for us, is that we see how reliable the gospel story is about Jesus, because it comes from these affirm Hebraic, Semitic, Aramaic sayings, teachings of Jesus. And it is a total life of Jesus. You know, I think it's wrong to say, well, there's a saying source, because you can see the whole source together. And it's a literary source that they're using. And I think there may also have been some changes in oral teachings at some points. But for the most part, I think we're safer seeing a literary connection. Now, oral tradition is not like we usually think, that oral tradition is something that we can change and adapt. Oral tradition was very much like a written tradition. It was set, and people were not changing it, but they're interacting with it. And of course, when we look at the Mishnah example, or oral commentaries, we see an oral tradition that was developed and then later written down, and we learn a lot about oral tradition and the way that it was preserved within a Jewish context. And of course, we have a lot of other oral cultures that were writing things down. And I think when we do studies, there's been some good studies on this. In the case of the Jewish texts, Birger Gerhardsen wrote a very helpful book. And, I think there's a lot more that could be written in deeper studies. But his on memory and manuscript, how we go from memory, putting it into manuscript. And so I think David Flusser, more so than, say, Bob Lindsay, would see a little bit more of the impact of some oral traditions might have influenced at some points. But I think one of the things we saw with Shmuel Safrai, David Flusser, Bob Lindsay, others, David Bibb, and others that are working this, Stephen Notley, is that there's a lot of consensus on these sources and seeing how they come together and isolating them, studying them in context, so that you have to have kind of a biological analysis of the text to see the undertext, but to see the bigger picture of all three Gospels, presenting each their understanding of who Jesus is and what is his message and what happened in his trial, his execution, his resurrection, and all of these stories. So powerful.
So can you talk a little bit more about the Marcan Cross factor in relation to Luke's omissions of material, if Luke supposedly knew Mark? Yes.
I think Mark probably had reasons for deleting some of the materials. I think for Jesus to be a teacher might not have been as important for his supposed audience. We think he was writing to Romans or non-Jews. I think for Jewish readers, the fact that Jesus is teaching Torah, one thing I think the Dead Sea Scrolls even indicate, of course, they're, from the time period, they may not represent all streams of Judaism. Certainly there were, some people like to say, Judaisms instead of one Judaism, but there are streams of different Jewish thought. But I think most Jewish streams of thought, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, would want their leader to be the Moreh HaTzedek, the teacher of righteousness, a teacher who is explaining, interpreting Torah. And that's a role that Jesus is prominent in the way that he's teaching the Torah and bringing it out. And Mark seems to minimize that, but he capitalizes on the holy man, the miracle worker, these different elements, the pressure on Jesus, the speed in which he's traveling, going from place to place. So there's a little bit of a different picture in Mark than we have in Matthew and Luke. When we see them together, I think we get a better picture fully of Jesus' life and ministry. They're not biographies in our sense. I think a lot of times people want to say, well, the Gospels are a biography in the modern sense, but really they're stories of this redemptive history. They're stories of the unfolding, revealing, unveiling of who Jesus is and his teachings. I think in the trial narrative, it's very interesting that in Luke's version, for instance, which I think is a little closer to the Hebrew Evangelion that we're studying. We see this important source that the high priest says, are you the anointed one? Are you the Messiah? And then Jesus kind of answers in this laconic way. Well, if I answer, you won't believe. If I ask, you won't answer. Well, I'd say that's very much a part of the Jewish dialectic. You know, you learn by asking questions, you have debate. And he says, you're not even willing to have a fair debate. But from now on, you'll see the Son of Man. That would have kind of brought up the idea of Daniel 7:13, Son of Man, that the Son of Man goes before the Ancient of Days, and to him is given all kingdom, authority, and power. He says, from now on, you'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Now, that's very interesting, because seated at the right hand of power could kind of make a remez or an allusion to Psalm 2, or when we go to Psalm 110. David Flusser felt like he was referring to Psalm 110 according to the Septuagint version, because in the Septuagint version of Psalms 110, it's a little bit different wording, very similar, but he says, you'll sit at my right hand, make your enemies your footstool. This day I have begotten you, just like Psalm 2:7. Hayom li'aleticha. And we see this even in the Aleppo manuscript, in the way you read it in some vowel pointings, but you also see this in the Septuagint, which is similar to Psalm 2:7. The Son of God, probably originally an enthronement psalm for the King of Israel, for David. He's being enthroned, and he's the Son of God, representing God on earth to the people of Israel. Because this day I've brought you forth. This day I've begotten you. I've brought you forth as you're enthroned in the enthronement. But in the Messianic teachings, it was the future Son of David, the Messianic King. But it's interesting that how the high priest responds to Jesus. He says, if I ask you, you will not believe. You will not answer. If I tell you, you will not believe. You'll see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Well, what David Flusser said, I think, is very brilliant. He says, well, this high priest was thinking of Psalm 110. He saw the reference to Daniel. He saw the reference to seated at the right hand of Mary. And what comes next? Thou art my son, this day I have begotten you. And so what does the high priest say? It's not a question, that's a declaration. Sometimes they put a question mark there, but he says, then you are the Son of God. And Jesus says, you say that I am. And so at that, the high priest is saying, we don't need any further witnesses. If he's the Son of God, like the Davidic Psalm, like Psalm 110, he is claiming this King Messiah reference. Yeah, we have a political charge that we can take to the Roman authorities. And so, in John's gospel, it's interesting how that Pilate asked Jesus, then, are you the king of the Jews? He says, well, if my kingdom was of this world, my disciples would be fighting for me. And he keeps asking about king, king, king. And so, I think we have that theme a little bit more in the Gospel of John, but very prominent in the Gospel of Luke, whereas because of this play on words between blasphemy, are the soldiers blaspheming Jesus as a part of their torture of him, prophesy. We don't believe prophecy. We don't believe in God, these Roman soldiers. We don't believe in the Jewish God. And they're beating up on Jesus, torturing him. And, this deep pain and anguish of Jesus in this situation, in this, the reality of the torture. But in the Gospel of Mark, he's kind of playing with this a little bit. Well, the high priest, he's trying to find Jesus blaspheming. And then, this impacts Matthew's order as well. Jesus is blaspheming. And then they go back to the soldiers holding Jesus, and then they're hitting him and blindfold him and say, prophesy, who hit you? So it's a little bit of a different story. But as we look at them synoptically, and we think of Luke as representing the Hebrew Evangelion, and we think about this in the literal Greek translation, and then we go right down into the gospel text where we see that this is the very powerful explanation of what happened when Jesus was in custody, the questioning with the high priest, probably these allusions to this text, Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of power, then you are the Son of God. You say that I am. We don't need any more witnesses. We've got it now. And so it's a political charge more than it is this religious charge where you're blaspheming our religious beliefs, Mark is saying. But blasphemy is not in Jewish faith and practice, it's according to the mission. It's not having theological, a lot of difficult theological disagreements. It's saying the holy name of God. It's blaspheming God's holy name, Giduf Hashem usually. So I'm not saying that some of these other things could have been considered abusive language and very difficult, but I'm just saying we got to look at the larger picture. Of course, we know the oral law is adapted, sometimes changes. We've got to be flexible, but I do feel like what you're seeing here is that they're emphasizing that something Jesus said is against the Jewish religious law, and that may be important for the high priest, but what's important for the Roman authorities? It's a political charge. It's not the religious charge, it's the political charge that he is claiming to be the Messiah. So all three accounts helps us put this together and understand a little bit better what was happening at the trial of Jesus. I really think, sometimes people have misunderstood this, even in the way that it's described in the Gospels. It says in Luke's Gospel that he was led away to their council, their court, their committee, really, of the high priests. And it's very different from when we see in Acts chapter 5, where Gamaliel was present. All of these leaders, or the whole Sanhedrin, was coming in. Now, the Greek word Sanhedrin, where we talk about that in Greek, it can be a committee, it can be a council. There was one of 23, but you couldn't have a Sanhedrin meet on a feast day or at night. And one of the big gospel questions is in John's Gospel, it's clear that Jesus is being crucified. It talks about the preparation day, that the lamb, he's being crucified on Passover. But in Luke and Matthew and Mark, the Passover supper comes before. And so I think probably one of the best explanations for this contradiction was offered by Paul Billerbeck, that likely there was more than one day that Passover was celebrated. I mean, we do see a different calendar at Qumran. We see evidence that the Sadducees had a different way of reckoning time than the Pharisees. I know when I lived in Jerusalem, it was interesting that, many Christians had different dates for, the Eastern Church, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, different dates for Christmas, for instance. And so it's probably not that unlikely that the Sadducees, who rejected the oral teachings of the Pharisees, might have had a different day. That would explain a lot, because I think when you see the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, you see everybody say, "Blessed is he who comes, the King." Here it is, Melech HaMashiach, the King Messiah, in the name of the Lord. And the Pharisees simply said, "Don't tell your disciples, don't do that." That's provocative for the Roman authorities to claim that you're the king. And Jesus says, well, if they are quiet, the stones will cry out. But then we see this episode where the scene is with Pilate, and he's talking, "Should I release to you Barabbas or Jesus?" And they're clamoring that Jesus should be taken. And, is that the same group of people? I mean, many people think, they were so fickle. One day they're saying he's the king. Blessed is he who comes. The next day they're saying crucify him. But I think if we look at this in the context, likely these are two completely different groups, different Jews. The Jews that are Sadducees, very connected to the Romans, they're coming to Pilate. You have the power of crucifixion. We see this movement as being very powerful, a messianic movement surrounding Jesus. We need to put a stop to it for Rome's sake. And Pilate is thinking, well, gee, I've got two prisoners here. One is for murder and insurrection, Barabbas, and I've got this other one, Jesus. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. He's a religious teacher of peace. I would rather take Barabbas to the cross. Yeah, but I have to release somebody on the day of the feast. Somebody has to be released. So the Sadducean priests, a different group entirely than coming in on the triumphal entry, said, no, take Jesus. He's a greater danger. We have no king but Caesar. Very, very shocking statement in the Gospel of John that we have no other king but Caesar. So here we've got kind of the more liberal, connected to the authorities, political leaders saying, we are with you. We're with the empire. We've got to stop this popular Messianic Jewish movement around Jesus. And they have the political charge. He's claiming to be king. He said he's the Son of God from Psalm 110. He's the Son of Man from Daniel 7:13. He has this high self-awareness. At least this is the picture that we're having from this Hebrew Evangelium of the Gospels there from that we see being reflected in the literal Greek translation, being a little bit reorganized, copied by Luke, known by Matthew, but Mark is changing it a little bit, and he's influencing Matthew to accept his changing. So we want to see all three Gospels together to get a clearer picture of what was in the Hebrew Evangelion as it's translated and passed down, and we can see it in both Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. When we look at the Lord's Prayer, I think the Hebrew Evangelion is very clear in the wording. Avinu Shabbat our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Yitkadesh Shemcha, very powerful in the way that it's presented. We also see that in the Beatitudes. We see it in the Sermon on the Mount. We see it in the teachings, the parables of Jesus very clearly. But we do see how, even in the parable of the sower, how that some of this is being changed. Luke has the phrase, who receives the word with a good heart, good and honest heart. And Matthew and Mark influencing Luke, make it more about the abundance of the return, kind of more emphasized in there, rather than the idea of, well, it's a good heart, which we have a lot of Hebrew parallelisms in. Is a good heart is the one who's very generous, who's a good neighbor, who's someone that sees the event. Different explanations of how a good heart brings all these fine qualities of discipleship together. What makes a really good disciple? And I think what Jesus is saying, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, that's what the parable of the sower is about. It's about how you hear and how you hear, apply, and do. And so the living Jesus was always talking about interpreting the Torah, seek first the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom was preeminent in Jesus' teachings. And so when we see it in this preeminence, he's talking about seek first the kingdom of heaven. All these other things will be added unto you. Love, forgiveness, reconciliation. This is the kingdom, bringing healing of mind and body and soul on earth to this community that's influencing others with this teaching of love. Even your enemy is yourself. And so as we see it unfolding in the trial narrative, those that are more connected with the Romans, the Sadducees, they're working together with others. There were some Pharisees that agreed with them. There are other common people that were agreeing with them, but they get the Chiliarchos, according to John's gospel, this high-ranking Roman official, to go and arrest Jesus and bring him to Pilate. And after they've questioned him, they're trying to get a political charge to bring him to Pilate. And probably most of the other Jewish people at the time, those that were on the Temple Mount when Jesus is teaching, they said, we couldn't touch him. There's too many people that love his teachings when he's on the Temple Mount. Or, they couldn't stop them from saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord on the triumphal entry episode. But after Passover, everybody's had 4 glasses of wine. They've been talking about the Exodus, the redemption all night, eating, and they're asleep. The disciples fall asleep. They can't stay awake with Jesus 1 hour. And that's when the Sadducees, with the betrayal of Judas, make their move with the Romans to arrest Jesus. And he's tried in the Roman court, and the Roman governor Pilate gives the death sentence. So the Romans are the ones who execute Jesus according to the best we can see from the historical record of the Gospels in the New Testament.
So to go back to my question, when you talk about, you addressed the part where, okay, Mark's omissions from Luke is easier to explain, but Luke's omissions when using Mark are more difficult to explain. One of the things you go over in their book is like the Syro-Phoenician woman, for instance. And you also talk about that 50% of Mark is missing from Luke and Luke's alleged use of Mark. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it is quite remarkable if Luke is copying Mark as his main source that 50% of Mark doesn't appear. In the text like the Syro-Phoenician woman, it's interesting, like you have this reference to the Canaanite woman, probably a little closer to Hebraic meaning, but you've got also the Syro-Phoenician woman. Very shocking story where Jesus says, "Will the dogs eat the crumbs of the table?" And she says, "Well, even the little puppy dogs have a right to eat." So you kind of see he's playing with her. I think really what he's trying to say is for her to understand that coming from a pagan background, that she has to look at God alone. And because of this strong faith, she's really saying, "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," so that he could say, by your faith has saved you. Her tenacity, it really doesn't look very good for Jesus to say that when a woman comes to him concerned about her daughter, he doesn't just respond immediately. He talks to her, he teaches her, he interacts with her on that place. But I think when you look at that in the connection between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see that Mark is expanding everything a little bit. It's impacting Matthew, but you find Luke's text a little stronger, a little clearer. And so this is a very good method of studying the text, recognizing that there are sources behind our synoptic gospels. And it's often been a question because when you read all three together, and I think this happens probably any pastor that's preparing a sermon on Sunday morning, maybe he's never read all three accounts, but he's going to preach on the Syro-Phoenician woman, on the Canaanite woman. So he reads all three accounts and he wonders, well, which one should I preach from? Or maybe I'll take a little bit from here and there. And sometimes they're a little bit different. So then you begin to see that there's a high identity of wording between all three. And so if you're thinking that each one wrote independently of each other, well, that doesn't make sense when they have such a high level of verbal identity. But then you have to explain where they depart from one another. And so what we do find is that Matthew and Mark, as we've been saying, have a much higher verbal identity between them. And that is why we, the Jerusalem School, begin to say, well, Mark is he's the explanation. What's the difference between Matthew and Luke? It's Mark. Mark is influencing Matthew and he's copying Mark. But there's other times that Matthew and Luke agree with each other. They're dependent on the same written source. When they're dependent on that same written source, they are showing this Hebraic source, the linguistics. And sometimes, I mean, a lot of times, Matthew's a little closer to the Hebraic undertext because Luke may be editing it a little bit. But we really see that. I love that story of the disciples of John the Baptist coming to Jesus. Are you the one who we should, are you the coming one or should we expect someone else? And when we read this in Matthew 11 and you compare it to Luke 7, high identity of wording all the way down to, about John the Baptist and Jesus. Now, then we get to kind of a difference because instead of the kingdom suffers violence and the violent take it by force, as it is in Matthew 11, Luke seems to disengage after talking about John as a prophet. And then later on in Luke 16, he picks up the preaching of the kingdom. And it's more about the preaching of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout all the earth and forceful men will lay hold of it. So we've got the forceful men very similar to Matthew's version. But, we see that reorganized text coming up in Luke, and he's taking the text a little bit differently. Now, when we do the linguistic analysis, thinking of the Hebrew undertext, I would argue that Matthew's version here, especially when we translate it a little bit more accurately, the kingdom suffers violence. I like the 1984 edition of the New International Version, which accepted the arguments of many Greek scholars who have said that instead of being a passive voice, suffering violence, it should be translated as an active voice. And they translated it, the kingdom of heaven is forcefully advancing. In other words, the kingdom is breaking forth. We translated it in the Newer Testament, the kingdom of heaven is powerfully breaking its way forward, and everyone breaking out with its power are seizing hold of it. Of course, I feel like that's much closer to the Greek, and as we translate it based on the Hebraic understanding, a Hebrew text, Malchut Shamayim Poretzet, Kol Portzimba, the kingdom is forcefully breaking forth. It's not the passive attack, but biadzamai could be a deponent verb, it could be a middle verb. But if you want to make it a passive verb, then you're going to say it suffers violence, the kingdom is under attack. But Jesus never talked about the kingdom under attack as much as he said, the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom is forcefully breaking its way out. So in that sense, he's answering John's question, who do people say that I am? And he was making a reference to Micah 2, 13 to 11, I think it's Micah 2, which talks about the breaker. It says, people of Israel are like sheep in a pen, and they're enclosed. And the sheep pen, just had a makeshift corral made of stones, usually piled up, whatever they could find. And then the breaker comes, breaks a hole in the fish, and the sheep that are in this enclosure want to break out very quickly. And so the Midrash says, well, the breaker is Elijah, and the king leading them out is the King Messiah, the Lord at the head of them. So I think this imagery goes back to maybe something that Jesus is alluding to in Micah and the Midrashic interpretation that John the Baptist, if you can accept it, he's Elijah who made a hole in the gate, this makeshift sheepfold as envisioned by Micah, the prophet, thinking about Israel in captivity, diaspora, and what the return will be like. And it's going to be fulfilled. The Lord is going to make a way. The king is going to come. The Lord will be at the head of them. And so we have in Malachi chapter 3, chapter 4 in the English version. Well, he is going to be the one who will turn the hearts of the children to their fathers. He's going to make a way in the coming, preparing the way for the coming of the King Messiah, the Davidic Messiah. So, and very powerful, I think in Malachi, it says, remember the law of Moses. You're upholding the law of Moses, which is, part of the messianic idea that the Messiah doesn't destroy the law, but he upholds it, interprets it properly, helps you understand it, apply it to your life in a practical way and spiritual way. So this is a very powerful text. But again, I think what we're seeing is here is text where Matthew and Luke totally agree at the very first. And then where we see Luke in this point case going off with the reorganized text in our stemma, kind of adapts it a little bit to preaching, making it easy, preaching the message, all very good teaching. But when you stay with Matthew, who's at this point closer to the Hebrew or Evangelion and leading it out, he is showing you that here is the way to understand the kingdom of heaven. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven is powerfully breaking its way forward, and people breaking out with its power. The disciples of Jesus are seizing hold of it. The NIV said, the kingdom from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven is forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. Also, I think, a very good translation in the 1984 edition. And I don't know, I hear a lot of pastors, they kind of want to make reference to the 1984 edition. They felt like that some of the revisions of the NIV at later times were less authoritative and maybe in the wrong direction sometimes. But each reading, each translation needs to be evaluated in its context. That's for sure.
So can you discuss a little bit about the variations of agreement between Matthew and Mark and the 8 variations according to Barr's diagram?
Now, Barr is really good if you go to his diagram, and he has these texts outlined and these variations where Matthew and Mark and Luke, are separating from each other. And I've got that Barr's diagram. I've used it a lot. I would recommend for students of the synoptic problem especially to kind of look at it, because it helps you to separate these sources and to see, well, here are the double tradition, the triple tradition. These are elements where it's reflected in math. And he uses a color breakdown for you so that you can see the variations of agreement between Matthew and Luke. And I think what we see is that, Matthew and Mark, when we see the variations between Matthew and Mark, we see the variations of Mark. Why are there variations? It's because he has another source, and that source he has in common with Luke. And when we have a minor agreement between Matthew and Luke against Mark, the reason why you have a minor agreement between Matthew and Luke against Mark, it's because they have a common source. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense that they would come up with the same wording. And we also find that when they're just together, the two of them, most of the time, many times, they are very close in their verbal identity. But we do see this other source that Luke had, that sometimes he's working with what we call the reconstruction source in the stemma. Luke had two sources. When Luke and Matthew are both using the Greek translation of the Hebrew or Evangelium, they have this strong identity of wording. So I think this figure in Barr's great diagram, which helps you kind of see the whole synoptic interrelationships in a multicolored chart, which is fantastic. I don't know, nowadays I'm sure there's it's probably online someplace. I don't know. I like paper, I like the books and things like that. So, but I imagine some of the viewers could find it. But I think you can see our stemma in Barr's diagram. Now, I'll have to say, just to be completely clear, Marcan priorists will explain Barr's diagram in light of their stemma. And they would say, well, this proves Marcan priority. I think this is how we evaluate the evidence. The most important thing is to see the evidence, and then you have to place it into different theories. And the problem I think we have with the Jerusalem school is that you really need to know both Greek and Hebrew, Aramaic. You kind of have to have the knowledge of these biblical languages. And a lot of people sometimes are working primarily with just the Greek, and they don't think as much of, well, is this a Semitism? For instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, where we have, if God clothes the birds of the air, they don't work, but he takes care of it. He clothes the lilies of the field. He feeds the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap. Well, Luke says ravens. He's giving you kind of a specific bird. But in Hebrew, we always have ophid. I don't think Matthew was making up these Semitisms. He wasn't copying the Septuagint, one theory that was advanced sometimes, But no, he's quoting a text that's very Semitic. And Luke at times is, editing a few things. He's adapting it a little bit on the Greek level. So, but both of them, in these pericope, pericope is a story unit, kind of. Sometimes people pronounce it more according to Greek, perikopa, but pericope is, or pericopa is a story unit or a teaching unit. So we have the teaching unit about the birds of the air, the flowers of the field. And here's another case, Jacob, that's so amazing to me. Just, it's what we call the argument from a minor premise to a major premise. He says, if God takes care of the birds, if God takes care of the lilies of the field, this is a minor premise, how much more will he take care of you? And in Hebrew, this is probably the earliest version of it is achat kama v'kama, achat kama v'kama, one more and more, or you can say mitzvah kala, mitzvah chamora. You can kind of compare it between the minor, the major commandment. You've got to be as diligent to observe the minor as the major. Both are taught by God, but adachat kama v'kama we see used in the rabbinic literature, the earlier sources, in the way that it's used, especially in Matthew's gospel. We also see it in Luke's gospel. Another example is the widow at midnight, the friend at midnight, and the widow and the judge. The friend at midnight comes and asks for a loaf because he has a friend and who's come to him, and his friend that's inside the house, he says, go away, my kids are asleep in bed. I'm not going to get up and give you anything. And the friend outside is so offended by this contemptible action of not giving him something. I mean, in this culture, Jewish, Middle Eastern culture, he has to open up his house. Your friend is my friend. If he's come on a journey and he's asking for bread, here, I'll give you fruit, vegetables. I'll give you a cherry. I'll give you a kid. I'll give you something. You can't just say, go away, don't bother me. But they say, how much more will God help you? Even if a contemptible friend will be moved to help you if you have persistence and strong-willed determination, a little bit of shamelessness that the text uses, shameless audacity to demand something. It's a way of seeing faith. Same way with the widow and the judge. The judge will not help the widow because of the justice of her cause, but he will help the widow because of her persistence. She says, vindicate me against my adversary in court. He says, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. Maybe this contemptible judge has been bribed. Jesus doesn't say that, but you're kind of thinking that there's something maybe corrupt about this judge. But the widow is persistent, and she keeps bothering him. One of the ways is that she might even hit him, attack him. So finally he says, I will give her what she wants. So the word pistis is used, but again, it's this idea of adachad kama v'kama. If a corrupt or an unjust judge will be moved by the persistence of a widow, how much more adachad kama v'kama will God hear the prayers of his people, the bachirim, those chosen, when they cry out to him in the case of the widow and the corrupt judge. And then we have the friend of midnight also. Probably what I argued in my book, even though that these parables appear in different chapters, quite in different contexts in Luke's gospel, Luke 11, Luke 19, 18, 19, I think it's 19, maybe it's 18, but probably originally they were twin parables, one to reinforce and strengthen the other. And we do have examples in rabbinic literature where there are dual parables, twin parables. We have the lost coin, the lost sheep. Jeremias, in his book on parables, kind of discussed which would be more original, the lost sheep or the lost coin. And he kind of felt like the theme of lostness was a theme of parables in it. But one was original, the other was secondary. And I think there's ample evidence to say that they reinforce and strengthen one another. You have two illustrations. By the mouth of two or three witnesses shall a matter be established. And we can see that in rabbinic illustrations and rabbinic parables. I think that associative comparative method where you study Jewish literature to see some of the parallels and compare them with the Gospels helps a lot. There was a very important article that was written by Samuel Sandmill, which I've cited. Samuel Sandmill is certainly one of my great heroes in biblical scholarship, but he warned against what he called parallelomania, where you just try to find Jewish parallels, you don't think about the context of the parallels of time. But I think when he's warning against, not studying the rabbinic literature scientifically, he's been interpreted, and that article is often cited to say there's no value in studying rabbinic parables. Now, I'd like to point out that Solomon Schechter, also one of my great heroes, a great biblical scholar and Jewish scholar. I mean, he commented on this type of thinking, and he talks about all the great German scholars that would kind of give a certain discussion of Jewish parallels or things from Judaism, but they would just kind of dismiss it. And I like the way that the term he used. He says, this is transcendental ignorance. Transcendental ignorance is to ignore evidence. Scholars aren't supposed to do this. And that's not what Samuel Sandmill was doing. He was against transcendental ignorance, in my opinion, just as much as Solomon Schechter was. But, when you study the rabbinic parallels, Jewish parables, for instance, you need to study them in context in their literature. You need to study the Gospels in their context and literature. But as a literary genre, the comparative associative method will help you understand both more clearly in their own context and make practical application. And especially, when we start looking at the linguistic background, because we can see the Hebrew of the rabbinic parables and that type of Hebrew, the Mishnaic Hebrew, the later biblical Hebrew that's moving in the direction of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Tanaim. The Gospels may not quite be there, but we kind of see a Hebrew in transmission. I think if we could find one of the original Hebrew Gospels, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that someday a Hebrew Gospel from the first century may turn up somewhere, maybe in a cave in Jordan, maybe someplace where early Christians were hiding and living. We'll see something like that. But it would help us know better what kind of Hebrew, what kind of Aramaic, or what kind of language that we have in the Gospels. And of course, we do have Aramaic translations of the Gospels, which help. And we have some Hebrew translations of the Gospels. I always like to tell people it's great to study Bob Lindsay's translation of the Gospel of Mark from Greek into Hebrew. And we have some different translations, usually of Matthew's Gospel, by certain Jewish scholars through the years studying the life of Jesus, and sometimes in dialogue or even in kind of a confrontational style and in confrontation with Jewish Christian persecution of the Jewish people at times, and sometimes just in disputations, understanding each other. And so today, I think it's very exciting that we see even the way that Jewish scholars and Christian scholars can work together to study the life of Jesus using a comparative associative method. And we'll understand Judaism better through the Gospels, and we'll understand Christianity better through Judaism. So we kind of help and strengthen one another when we study together. Let's refuse that approach of transcendental ignorance that has been, so much a legacy of the church, and embrace a study of the parallels. But let's not go into parallel mania where we study it without the context and the actual meaning of each text.
And before we go back to the presentation, I just want to ask for clarification. So the reorganized source text that both Matthew and Luke used to acquire the minor agreements and the double tradition material, in a sense, serves as basically, it serves the same function as Q in the diagram. Would that be fair to say? Because that's where Matthew and Luke get the double tradition material from. That's not in Mark.
Yeah, I think it would be true to say that what scholars identify as Q is in some ways reflected in that reorganized text. But I tend to see it more than, saying sources. I think like we're studying the trial of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. I think it had the whole story. I think there's more in that reorganized text than is in Q.
Right.
And I think that's helpful. But, we kind of have to reorganize this, how we said. Sometimes, scholars used proto-Mark. They said, what was Mark like before Mark was written? So Mark there's an early version of Mark and then it's revised. That's one reason. That's one way they try to account for the minor agreements or some of these other things. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't really evaluate the evidence properly. But I think you're really onto something there, Jacob. I like the way you're thinking about this.
Well, thank you. I just find it interesting that, because yes, I understand that reorganized source text is not exactly like Q, but what I mean is it serves that function of repetition material, and it serves the function of proto-Mark in a sense by explaining the minor agreements between Matthew and Luke, not explained by Mark. Now, could you talk a little bit about the Luke not containing the cursing of the fig tree?
Yeah, it's very interesting because almost all of the miracles in Jesus are producing fruit or something good. And we actually do have a rabbinic parallel where laborers are wanting to get fruit. There's no fruit. And then, a miracle worker, prays it and, it starts producing fruit. So, it's always difficult to know how these texts develop. Are these independent sources that came from oral tradition? Are there something in the reorganized text that Matthew knew, or did Mark know it from a reorganized text? What makes me feel a little uncomfortable sometimes is the fact that people often see, well, every time there's a fig tree, it represents Israel. And so Matthew and Mark, Jesus is cursing Israel for not producing fruit. I think it would be, a little better if they say, well, the fig tree could be somehow symbolic to corrupt temple priesthood or some of the Jews or something, but sometimes they take it that way. I really think we've got to see it in the context of the Gospels where Jesus is, he doesn't make a direct connection between Israel or the leadership. It's just showing this power of Jesus that he has power, some miracles over nature. He stills the storm. He speaks and the wind, storms obey him. There are some miracles of healing, miracles of forcing out the evil, this evil presence, these entities, exorcisms. And I think it shows even in Jerusalem that he had authority over all and who he was. But the fact that Luke doesn't have it, I mean, one way to interpret it would be that this wasn't in the reorganized text, and it seems to be something that Mark developed based on, the story of you'll cast the tree into the sea, uproot the tree by your faith, and here is a tree that's uprooted by your faith. So I always, one of the things I like to warn against, in my opinion, I know people love symbolism, Jacob, and I see this sometimes. I always want to say, well, there's all this symbolism. There's code words in the parables, and we just have to know the code. We got to be really careful. I always say you have to have something that the storyteller tells you and forces it, or you have to have something in the context. For instance, usually people say the king is always representative of God, or in this case, the fig tree always represents Israel. Well, actually, we have a parable where Jesus is talking about discipleship. And he says, what do you count the cost of serving me and seeking first the kingdom, loving God with all your heart, loving your neighbor as yourself? You've got to count the cost. What if a king is going to war? He has 10,000 soldiers. The other king has 20,000 soldiers. What is he going to do? He's going to send an envoy of peace. Probably people laughed at this. It's kind of a humorous way of discussing things. Maybe it's something that we know of or people knew of. But he also says, what if you're building a tower in a vineyard and you can't fix it? Well, that's shame. The king has shame that he can't fight the war. The guy can't even build a tower in his vineyard. What shame is that? You got to count the cost. But there the king is connected in the context and the storyteller to a disciple trying to decide whether to follow Jesus or not. See? So that's not, the king is not God in that story. So sometimes you have to let the storyteller impose that meaning on. I'd say the same thing in the parable of the leaven. He says the kingdom is like leaven in the dough. It grows and grows. And there he's illustrating the force of the kingdom to permeate the loaf, and it's the continuous growth and the strength of the kingdom. The kingdom releases a force. When you forgive someone that's offending you, it's the force of the kingdom. When you love someone that hates you, it's the force of the kingdom that overcomes hate, overcomes unforgiveness, and works for reconciliation and healing in a world that's suffering so much. But most of the time in Jewish literature, when we talk about leaven, it's a symbol of sin. And we see this in Passover a lot, when you're taking out the leaven, burning it, or Paul says a little leaven. Leaven's a whole lump, meaning that a little sin can increase and overpower a community, overpower a person. Rabbis talk about leaven in the loaf, which is like, the sinfulness in a human being. But again, you have to see the context and the storyteller. So how do we see the context and the storyteller? You got to take a lot of care before you can say, well, the leaven is always the evil inclination. The leaven is always sin. No, in this case, the power of the leaven is compared to the force of the kingdom. And so when people want to say the fig tree is always Israel and it's being cursed, well, I think there's some problems with that. And I think there's also some connections to Jesus being the miracle worker who can make the fruit come. He can wither the fig tree by cursing it. And he is, at this time, completely in charge as he's facing the cross in this final week. He even has power over nature, as we see in other nature miracles. And, I don't know, I think a lot of people in the Jerusalem school would probably see, well, where did this story come from? Was it really in the proto-evangelion and passed down, or, does it have other sources? Is it an oral tradition maybe, or something else? But, it's kind of hard when we see something like that without all the connections that we see to the proto-evangelion. But we do know that, what we have in the Gospels, I think that's something that Christians, we have to take by faith, that, our Gospels are reliable, our sources are reliable. We need to try to understand them in the context. And I think we have to take a little step back. I know today, as we're filming this is Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, and in our community, it's going to be commemorated a little bit later in the week. But Shoah, Yom HaShoah, we remember the terrible suffering of the Jewish people in the Second World War, and the murder of 6 million, and the reprehensible actions of the Nazis, and so many that collaborated with them throughout Europe, and people that were silent bystanders. And it's something we have to study and contemplate always, that it won't happen again. But I think as Christians, we have to acknowledge that sometimes Christian anti-Jewish sentiments have impacted the way we interpret the Gospels to try to show this great antagonism between Jesus and everything Jewish. And really, I think what we find when we study the Gospels is that Jesus is, one with his people. David Flusser wrote in one of his books, My Teacher, I don't really see anything that Jesus said that would really challenge or upset or, greatly offend any well-intentioned Jew of the time. I mean, Jews at the time, Hillel and Shammai, they argued, they debated, they interacted with one another. And so we want to see Jesus believably in his time. And so for a Jewish rabbi to curse the whole people of Israel and the rabbi and the fig tree, I think is a little far-fetched, and probably, is rooted a little bit in this anti-Jewish reading of the Gospels that has probably been a poison two ways. One way, it leads people in the church to have ill feelings towards Jewish people in their lives. But in the other way, it poisons their understanding of Jesus and his times, because he wanted to see the restoration of Israel. We see in Acts 1:6, where the disciples say, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he says, it's not for you to know the times and the season. It's going to be determined by the Father. But it seems like there's something very positive in what's going to be determined by the Father. And he also prophesied the destruction of the temple. I think we see this in the gospel narratives, maybe not. I think that he would like to have seen a great spiritual revitalization that might even have been like Jonah, which would have prevented the destruction of Nineveh when all the people of Jonah repented. But people weren't aware of the day of their visitation. And I think there's a really shock element there. Cursing of the fig tree. This is Jesus' power over nature. And so it's very interesting when we think about it in the way the synoptic gospel sources come there. But it's also very interesting to see in the context, Matthew, Mark, what are they thinking? What are their sources? How are they interpreting it? And my feeling is they're really seeing Jesus exercising faith and speaking the word. You know, there's a little difference between having faith. I command you without doubt, but there's what we call a gzerah. It's like a declaration. No more fruit will be coming from you. But again, we see Jesus having the power over nature at this story.
So now I would like to shift to the trial narrative as we close. So when you look at Luke, Mark, and Matthew from the lamentation of Jerusalem that Luke talks about, and then you start seeing different elements. Similar story. It's almost the same, but it's a little different in Mark and Matthew from Luke. Can you tell us what's going on there and how they understand Pilate and Caiaphas and the motivation to crucify Jesus being more political?
Yes, I think traditionally Christians have said that Jesus was crucified because of his theology. I've seen this in parables books, really interesting. I think it was C.F. Smith. I know there's several Smiths, but he wrote an influential book on the parables. But he said Jesus taught in parables. Jesus was crucified. He was crucified because of his parables. Well, we have thousands of rabbinic parables, and they weren't crucified. I think that's what you call circular reasoning. So I think when we're reading these stories, we really want to look at the history. Josephus gives us a lot of important history and the way that Romans dealt with Messianic Jewish movements. I mean, they put them down. They killed the leaders. I remember Josephus talks about the sons of Judas the Galilean coming in Jerusalem. They just crucified him right away. They have to maintain the Pax Romana, a Roman peace, and they do it by the edge of the Roman sword. And so many had power and influence and money and economics because of their connections with the Romans. And I think you would have to say that Herod the Great brought prosperity. I mean, some people benefited greatly by the works of Herod the Great and the connections he had with Rome and other empires, and the trade, the commerce, exchange of culture, all these things were going on. And when you see Jesus coming on the scene, this is something that concerned many people. In John chapter 11 is very interesting at the raising of Lazarus, which is these signs. You've got the gospel of signs as kind of the foundation of the gospel of John. And it comes up to chapter 11, raising of Lazarus, and Caiaphas and others. These are the Sadducean priests. They're connected to the Romans more. They're connected to the temple complex. All the priests are Sadducees. And he's saying if Jesus goes on like this, the Romans will come and destroy our place. They'll destroy the temple. They'll destroy our people. And so they had a fear of Rome. And they felt like that it's better, as he said, that one man would die, Jesus, rather than the whole people be destroyed. And so we kind of see how John's gospel is setting up this. It's interesting, really, the fact that the synoptic gospels do not mention the Romans. And there seems to be an effort not even to say something very negative about the Romans, which might have invited persecution. And I think by the time you get to the Gospel of John, there's already been persecution, the destruction of the temple. Things are changing. But when we come to Luke here, the 19:41 through 44, a very powerful text where Jesus is looking out on Jerusalem. I think there's a part of the physical person of Jesus. They say Jesus wept. We said he broke down in tears. Jesus just had this sense of, in his heart of hearts, that he wanted to see Jerusalem saved. He wanted to see spiritual revitalization. But he spoke like a Hebrew prophet. And he made reference to Ezekiel, and he made reference to other texts which describe a destruction of the city. And he said, if you had just known the day of your visitation, there could have been a spiritual revitalization and renewal. And maybe this could have been avoided. Now, there are some aspects of prophecy probably that cannot be avoided, and they're just going to be played out in history. That's one way that we look at prophecy. I think another way we look at prophecy is that it does matter how we respond to it. But here we see Jesus loving the Jewish people, loving Jerusalem, weeping for Jerusalem. There's not this excitement, well, blood will be at the belly of the horse or up to the bridle. I don't know, sometimes I hear, prophecy teachers who want to look at prophecy as a way to foretell what will happen. I really think that prophecy is more a call. It's the voice of God calling us to right relationship. It's telling us God's plan for us to come into right relationship with him. And maybe a lot of these prophecies, we'll know them as we're living through them, but to try to study the book to see what's going to happen before it's happening is what was sometimes decried in the Jewish literature as mechashvei haketz. You're trying to determine the end. I like the way that Maimonides said that when you try to determine the end, it doesn't profit you for the love of God or the fear of God. The most important thing is the love of God and the fear of God. I think Jesus could agree with that. We also see in the 13 benedictions, which is attributed to Maimonides, that he said that, his 13 principles start with, I believe in total faith, and he says, I believe in total faith in the coming of the Messiah. And even if he tarry and does not come, I will not stop believing that every day he will come. Now, that is, a high expectation. Every day the Messiah will come. And yet at the same time, if you're getting caught up in determining the time of the text, well, that could be problematic. Focus on the love of God, the fear of God. We need to have a balance between the awe and reverence of God and the love of God. And I really think that's what we see characterized in Jesus' teachings. And we see this part of the coming into Jerusalem accentuated in Luke's gospel. I would say it's very Hebraic. I don't know, I found several parallels to this idea of I was with you in the desert. I was with you in the divine visitation of the desert. I was with you at the divine visitation at the crossing of the Red Sea. I was with you all the way, a divine visitation. But a divine visitation in Jeremiah can also be the restoration of Jerusalem after it's destroyed, but the divine visitation can also be the destruction of Jerusalem and the teaching, the prophecies of Jeremiah when he sees the corrupt leadership and the priesthood, the king, the people unwilling to listen to the word of the Lord as it's being prophesied and told to create real repentance. It's very powerful when you read there in Jeremiah 36 as they're reading the prophet's words, and the king is taking a knife and cutting the scroll up and burning it. I'm going to burn this word. I don't want to hear all these things that we're doing wrong that we have to change. And he refused to hear the word. And Jeremiah says they didn't rend their garments. They didn't repent. They didn't ask for forgiveness. And so we see this same prophetic passion with Jesus. I think it's interesting that some scholars have seen even connections between Jesus and Jeremiah. Jeremiah, sometimes referred from chapter 10 and 11 as the weeping prophet. He says, oh, that I just had a river that I could weep the tears that I feel for my people. And I think that's what we sense here when we see Jesus coming into Jerusalem, stopping, weeping, breaking down in tears, and just longing for everyone to recognize that this is an important time, an urgent time, a time of visitation, and to be ready for it. Jesus fulfilled that role of a prophet, and he fulfilled that role as a healer. He fulfilled the role as a suffering servant. He fulfilled that role as the coming king, and he promised that my first coming, I will put this into operation, but the second coming, I will fulfill all of these prophetic expectations, the end of war, the end of racism, hunger, famine. We'll see this total restoration. So I think when we look at these passages, and especially when you read them in Greek and Hebrew, it's so moving because you see these terms, like the term here, you didn't know the time of your visitation. I mean, this is very, very Hebraic and prophetic in the life and teachings of Jesus. And of course, very characteristic of Luke and the proto-evangelium in Hebrew that we're studying and talking about tonight.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Brad Young.
Well, thank you, Jacob, so much. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for all your good questions and your serious research. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.